All right, we are going to start. We are live on YouTube as well, and the participants will then keep on joining. Good evening, viewers. I'm Rabia Akhtar, Director, Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, housed in the School of Integrated Social Sciences at University of Lahore. We are here yet with another edition of CSSPR webinar series. I'm joined today by my colleagues Hassan Fariduddin Virk, lecturer in the School of Integrated Social Sciences, and Syed Ali Zia Jafri, research associate in CSSPR University of Lahore. A word to the attendees. Thank you for joining us today. Please type your questions for Andrew in the chat or Q&A box, and we will get in as many of you as possible. The topic of our discussion is China-Pakistan relationship, and the title of this webinar is China-Pakistan Axis. It should have been followed by a question mark, but guess we will ask our guest that question instead. Our guest speaker today is Andrew Small, who is the author of this excellent path-breaking book titled The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. Andrew is a senior transatlantic fellow. Just give me a second. I forgot to hit the recording. All right. So let me introduce Andrew. Andrew is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a non-resident senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He also holds a visiting fellowship at the Australian National University's National Security College. Andrew is well published in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Quarterly, as well as many other journals, magazines, and newspapers. Andrew is a graduate of the Balliol College, University of Oxford. Good morning and welcome to the discussion, Andrew. So a lot has happened and is happening since your book came out in 2015. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was launched in 2016. India and Pakistan have had several crisis situations in which China played a role in crisis management. The deoperationalization of Articles 370 and 35A, whereby BJP declared J&K and Ladakh as its union territories, the outbreak of the pandemic and the world blaming China, and the current standoff between India and China in Ladakh, with several earlier episodes in Doklam and Sikkim. We would like your views on the current situation in our region. Do you see Pakistan as a factor in the current Sino-Indian border crisis? How do you see the evolving nature of the China-Pakistan relationship and Pakistan's role in helping President Xi achieve the China dream? I seldom agree with Bruce Riedel, but I like his characterization in his review of your book of the region's dual axis, AXES, and their evolving relationships, India and America on one hand, and Pakistan and China on the other hand, that he says will be central to the global order in our times. Do you buy that argument of dual axis? But before I give you the virtual floor, I have two opening questions for you, which I would like you to address in your formal remarks. My first question is about the title of your book. I'm sure you've heard a lot of this before in every other interview. So in 1936, Mussolini gave a speech in Milan where he celebrated a new treaty of friendship with Germany, which signaled Italy's political realignment. He said, and I quote, "This Berlin-Rome Protocol is not a barrier, it is rather an axis around which all European states, animated by a desire for peace, may collaborate on troubles." This is the first time the term axis was introduced, and later on when his speech was published in New York Times and read widely, this alliance between Italy and Germany, which signified profound shift in Italy's alignments in Europe, came to be known as the Rome-Berlin axis, which later on fed to the Allies versus Axis terminology of the Second World War. Andrew, your choice of the term axis for China and Pakistan unnerves a lot of us here in Pakistan, mainly because of the negative connotations the term axis has gained over a period of years, only to be revived by the use of the term axis of evil by George Bush in 2002. You write in your book that John Kenneth Galbraith, who served as United States ambassador to India under the Kennedy administration, worried about Pakistan forming some kind of axis with Peking. Is that where you have taken this inspiration to call the China Pakistan relationship an axis of sorts? I'm sure you have been asked this, but for our audience in Pakistan and elsewhere, please let us know why do you think this is an axis, especially when the underlying argument in your book is that the coupling between the two has been a loose one. So hold your thought on this. This was my first question. The second is, in my own research work, I've come across so many instances where the US was dismissive of Pakistan's India threat. Even when General Zia gave voice to Pakistan's threat perceptions vis-a-vis Indo-Soviet collusion after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the US dismissed it as a figment of his imagination. China, on the other hand, understood it completely, empathized with Pakistan because it had dealt with the same adversary in 62. And to me, that sheer understanding brought the two closer together in a sustainable manner, which never happened in the Pakistan US case. So I would like your views on that as well. With this, I would like to give you the floor to make your formal remarks. And if you could address these two opening questions as well. Please unmute yourself and welcome again.
Thanks very much, Rabi.
So I would like your views on that as well. With this, I would like to give you the floor to make your formal remarks. And if you could address these two. Sorry about that. Okay.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the chance to join this discussion. Looking forward to more of your comments, thoughts, questions, and those of your colleagues too on this. Let me make a couple of points just first in response to the axis bit of the question, and then I think I'll kind of make a couple of broader remarks about the nature of the China-Pakistan relationship, really jumping off the second question about the kind of shared understanding of threats and how far that's provided a glue for the relationship. So I'm glad you cited Bruce Rydell's comments on the axis term, which I have also cited since after his review, because as you will know from the book itself, it's not framed as a sort of hostile, threatening configuration. The use of the language, which I can see why one might react to it, I think is not intended in that sense. I think the framing that he has of these kind of axes around which the region turns, I think is a helpful one, because I don't think you characterize it as a loose coupling. I think part of the purpose of the book was to show that actually it is a deeper and more significant relationship than I think people had perhaps understood, including on the Chinese side, I have to say. When I talked to a number of Chinese experts after the book came out, one of the comments I had from them was that they hadn't, for a lot of people working in the Chinese strategic community, they hadn't really, in one sense, thought about or appreciated the significance of the relationship with Pakistan. The specialists understood it. Some people in the PLA understood it, but the wider strategic community didn't. And that's not because I wrote a book on it, but rather that there was this juncture around 2015 and the Xi Jinping visit, in which there was this kind of much deeper revisiting of kind of what the significance of the relationship with Pakistan amounted to in the new strategic context that China was facing. And I think, as we've seen in the years since the book came out, I think there is a greater strategic salience to the relationship than I think had been understood, not just in the contemporary context for China, but looking back historically at the role the relationships played in the region. And let me kind of go on from that, from jumping off from your second question, to talk about what that's I think amounted to for China, for Pakistan, for the relationships with India as well. Clearly, it has been a highly security-centric relationship. And as I say, I mean, I think there's no question, as you suggest, India and the certain shared threat perceptions with India have provided that kind of glue between the two sides really throughout, and I think this even extends to the present day. I think after this phase in the early 60s to early 70s, in which you have really genuine questions in 65, 71 about two-front wars and whether China would be willing to intervene on Pakistan's behalf, you then have a model that develops that lasts pretty much until the present day, and certainly until the launch of CPEC, in which China essentially sees Pakistan as occupying this valuable counterbalancing role vis-a-vis India, and then seeks to ensure that it has the capabilities, largely militarily, to play that role effectively without Beijing tending to get involved directly in the conflicts or crises or making any formal commitments to that effect. And so what you get really from particularly the early 70s onwards is a relationship that's quite heavily kind of procurement and capabilities focused. China, of course, becomes Pakistan's largest arms supplier, but it also assists with the development of a lot of Pakistan's indigenous military industrial capabilities as well, the kind of the low-end things, tanks and so on, to the backing that China is willing to provide at the most sensitive levels to Pakistan's nuclear and missile programs. And then I think a lot of the relationship beyond that is then built out from this core security relationship and the level of trust that's then engendered between the two militaries in particular over a period really of decades. And clearly there are all sorts of other forms of support that the two sides provide each other diplomatically, in particular Pakistan brokering China's relations with a number of other powers during China's kind of period of isolation, most famously with the United States, but also other cases such as Saudi Arabia and other examples as well. The role that Pakistan plays in preventing militant groups from targeting China that becomes more and more important in the relationship from the 1990s on. But of course, the relative balance of how important these factors have been has shifted over time, particularly as China's power position has grown. Clearly, Pakistan's value as, say, a diplomatic broker is not what it was in the 70s. The importance of Pakistan as a source for technologies, which it was at a certain juncture, has gone down. PLA capabilities have improved so significantly that it has a far greater salience for Pakistan's own capabilities looking out in the future. So these elements have varied. And you've had different fronts opening up since as well, where Pakistan's played an important role for China. Counterterrorism issues, of course, as mentioned, but then some of these other questions that have been coming to the fore more in recent years. PLA naval access to the Indian Ocean, a number of which have become more important to China as its kind of global power projection needs have grown, and the value within that of reliable partners has grown as well, because you can't make some of these long-term global power projection plans without partners that you can really rely on at the absolute highest level in all imaginable crises. I think there's been less congruence of interests between the two sides when it comes to Afghanistan militancy than on the India question, and there have been points of tension as a result of that, particularly over questions like, for a period of time, Uyghur militant presence in FATA, which has since largely gone away, or some of the security threats to Chinese nationals in Pakistan. But most of these tensions have been navigated quite discreetly between the two sides, and that's really also been a hallmark of the relationship. It's been managed very quietly, even at times secretively, by a fairly narrow cast of people on both sides, largely in the PLA and the Pakistani army, who've understood the value of the relationship and really insulated it from whatever inside or outside pressures there've been. And there have been pressures. If you look out over a few decades, there have been significant external pressures on the relationship. The normalization of Sino-Indian relations was a kind of a watershed moment. You look at specific pressures such as US sanctions on Chinese support to Pakistan's missile program, and a number of other cases. But it's proved pretty resilient in the underlying structure through all of that period. And it's also notably been non-exclusive. China really wanted Pakistan to benefit from outside financial support, outside military support, particularly from the United States. So it's rarely seen Pakistan's relations with other powers in zero-sum terms. It's rather on the converse side been wary about any situation in which there might be a risk of excessive reliance or expectations on Pakistan's part, or any situations in which a kind of juncture of isolation or pressure on Pakistan could turn into problems for China too. And so until very recently, and we'll kind of go on to talk about this too, I think, China historically was not just comfortable with the US-Pakistan relationship, it actively wanted to ensure that Pakistan had access to the best US weapons suppliers in particular. And when US-Pakistan relations were good, essentially Pakistan, from China's perspective, was even better able to fulfill the kind of balancing role that China wanted it to play. And of course, there's then less pressure on the China-Pakistan relationship itself, particularly when it comes to things like arms and technology transfers and so on. So that's the kind of context, I think, when going into 2015, when we get to CPEC. I'll just say a couple of things about CPEC, particularly about the expectations on China's part, because I'm sure there'll be lots to discuss about that and where it's headed. So I won't preempt all of that. There are all the sort of specific benefits that accrue to Chinese firms, the other elements of the logic around the Belt and Road as a whole. Pakistan was, of course, a good fit. There's been a long-term intention to upgrade the relationship. It used to be described as a stool on two legs that had the diplomatic and military component, but where the economic component was always very weak. There's always been a sort of intention to do this on both sides' part, but the Belt and Road, the nature of the Belt and Road, large infrastructure projects, rather than the kind of traditional structure of the trade relationship, meant that there was a sort of sense at the juncture that the Belt and Road initiative was launched to pushing ahead with a very different kind of economic relationship with Pakistan than was possible before. But I think it was also paired with this broader sense on China's part, as I mentioned, and coming back to this kind of axis, whether it's viewed pejoratively or not, term, that the relationship was essentially ripe for an upgrade. And you see this in a lot of the debates on the Chinese side about a kind of rebalancing of its non-alignment policy. China starting to think more seriously about friends and allies or quasi-allies as it starts to become more of a power with global reach, global interests. It needs naval facilities it can use. It needs options for forward deployments. And really, when China looks around, when you get if you look at the sort of internal analyses on the Chinese side on this by, say the PLA Navy or whoever, Pakistan is kind of in a tier of its own in terms of kind of trustedness of partners. And so you started after 2015 to hear language from as much from Chinese analysts as anything else that you just hadn't heard used about the relationship before. Terms like Pakistan being China's one true ally, its closest partner, the relationship being a model for others to follow, that had really not been expressed publicly before. And CPEC was also kind of intended to function as sort of an instrument and catalyst for this upgraded relationship. Much deeper Chinese economic involvement, far more expansive presence in Pakistan, a much broader based relationship between the two sides, significant increase in political focus, traffic between the two sides at the political level. And you had a bit of a belief on the Chinese side among some at this point that you could even bring about something along the lines of a kind of dehyphenation in relations with Pakistan and India. And this was language that I would hear from Chinese analysts, particularly around 2015, 2016, that basically, unlike the old securitized version of the relationship, where there still had to be a certain degree of treading around some of Indian sensitivities, if it was a big upgrade for the economic relationship, you could do this without worrying as much about the repercussions. And this was partly making a fact of the optics around Xi Jinping doing this dedicated visit to Pakistan when he had the visit, rather than the traditional thing, which is the pairing of visits to Pakistan and India, which had been going on for decades until this point. And at the same time, going back to the kind of foundational question, CPEC also seemed to act kind of in service of this traditional strategic goal for the relationship as well, this counterbalancing element. The Chinese side at the time of CPEC's launch talked about this notion of a kind of more comprehensive bolstering of Pakistan's capabilities beyond military balancing, about Pakistan being even more attuned in the way that China is obsessively attuned to the kind of economic basis for national power. And so a lot of this was kind of feeding in the debates on the Chinese side when CPEC was launched. And I think this was much more important than the kind of supposed strategic goals that are often debated around CPEC about routes from Xinjiang to Gwadar and things like that I think are economically difficult, topographically very difficult. And of course, there are a lot of things that China already gets in Pakistan's case and didn't need CPEC to facilitate, particularly in terms of access to military facilities, the deep security relationship, and some of these kind of strategic goals around that people talk about for CPEC, again, particularly around the kind of corridor elements, really don't show up in the plans, in the practical plans in a very significant way. I think still a lot of skepticism on the Chinese side about energy transportation routes, about the feasibility of them. And of course, you see very little new cross-border infrastructure, apart from fiber optics and things. So strategic for China in Pakistan's case has, in my view, meant a kind of reinforcement and expansion of some of the elements of the role that it's played in China's calculations for some time. Some new elements, of course, as discussed in terms of these kind of Pakistan's role as facilitating China's global power projection capabilities and so on, but also CPEC as a means of kind of reinforcing the traditional conception of the role that Pakistan was supposed to occupy for China in the region. Has CPEC actually facilitated all of this? That's something that I think we can then go on to discuss. I'll leave the kind of opening remarks there.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Would you also want to comment something about the current situation on the Indo-Chinese, border standoff? And if you think there is a Pakistan factor in that, would like you to comment a bit about, the decision BJP took of deoperationalizing the Articles 370 and 35A. And do you think if that is a factor that has played some role in China moving ahead, securing Ladakh, not becoming a union territory, is that a signal? So would like your views on that. Over to you.
Sure, I'll say a couple of things about that. I would also note, since you did a very good discussion on these points with Tanvi the other week, and I'd urge anyone who's watching this and didn't see that, it was very exhaustively and impressively covered, and I think you're doing a session with Ashley Tellis as well. So there is within this kind of quite a long list of considerations that come into play here. Let me just touch on one, because I think there is always this question of how far the kind of internal logic of the relationships between the different parties is driving China's approach and how far it's being conditioned by kind of the wider strategic context. My sense is that there is always in any of these situations a kind of specific internal logic in terms of the status of Ladakh, the responses to Chinese Indian infrastructure build up. I can go through that whole list. It's very hard to see this outside the context of what's been going on through the pandemic and other elements of how China's been behaving in the last few months on other issues. There's Hong Kong, of course, South China Sea, and how China's approached this through the pandemic. I think there has been a sense that there is a kind of window in which, particularly as the relations with the US have really reached a floor under this administration, that there is also a window before the elections in November in which it may make sense to push forward on a series of different fronts, because the relations with the US have, in the current context, not so much further to fall. So you have seen a series of kind of maneuvers and risks taken, all of which have their internal logic as well. I mean, the decision on the national security law for Hong Kong, for instance, is something that has a rationale that is entirely constructed around Xi Jinping's view of Hong Kong, what's played out there over the last year, and obviously you can analyze it through that prism, and that's certainly true on the border with India as well, and I think you've covered some of those issues very well. But why is there a willingness to do this now at this particular period of time? And again, you can talk about the weather and operational benefits from the fact they were conducting military exercises on the border and India wasn't. And, I mean, there are all of these kind of opportunistic factors as well. But I do think you also have to step back and say, if you're looking out in a series of different environments at how China's approaching its neighborhood, some of the issues that it's been hesitant to take certain moves, you're now seeing a kind of pushing out on all of these different fronts at the moment. So I do think that stepping back and looking at this in the wider context of what forms of behavior on China's part does it think it's able to get away with, or feels that it has to push ahead with now while this window exists before the election, because I think they expect there'll be a kind of resetting of sorts, a reconditioning certainly of the relationship if a new president is elected, and they'd rather not have some of these things play out in an environment in which that's taking place. And that's on one side. On the other hand, you also have a school of thought on the Chinese side, which is just, we are moving into a full-on Cold War situation. Why show restraint on some of these issues? Accept the logic for where this is headed, push ahead with these moves, don't tread around some of these sensitivities in the same way that you were before. Again, in the final analysis, the border with India ends up being managed quite judiciously. You're not getting, as you did with Doklam, all of the kind of ginning up of nationalist pressures in the Chinese press or anything like this. This is still being managed relatively quietly at the diplomatic level between the two sides. But why is it happening now? And yes, there are some of these factors that have fed into it that are intrinsic to the Sino-Indian relationship, but there is also this wider context, I think, for China's behavior. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see more maneuvers of different sorts during the period between now and the very late stage of the presidential elections.
Thank you so much for taking on these questions. I know it's an evolving situation, and there are a lot of bets out there. So let's see which way the situation turns. I would now like to move to my colleague Hassan. Hassan, I would unmute you, and you can ask your question from Andrew. Andrew, you can mute yourself while Hassan asks the question. So, just give me a sec.
Andrew, or the process of writing history is something between art and protest. It's art to create a discourse in the sequence of events or the historical timelines and epochs, as we call them. The protest, you are protesting against the set values, the set rules that other scholars or historians have done before you. So you have done the same thing in your book. You have protested against the idea of Pak-China all-weather friendship as it is explained in flowery terms and words. So I would like to laud on your struggle with the protest thing. And my query will be from you regarding the process of hardening of a country's defense capacities. So sponsoring the process of hardening of a country's defense capacities, for example, the Ford administration sold military-related technology to China, So this process brings about a radical change in the posturing behavior of that particular country towards its rivals slash enemies. So if that hypothesis can claim longevity, then does that mean history coming to a full circle when China is arming Pakistan to counterbalance US support to India, or when India and Pakistan indulge in posturing or asymmetric attacks on each other? So that's my question.
Thank you, and thanks for the comments on the book as well. Just a couple of things then on that. I mean, the concern that China has had on this is that given India's larger territory, larger economic capabilities, there is also a specific concern that Pakistan falls behind, regardless of the US-India dynamic. The US-India dynamic has been a kind of reinforcing element in this, certainly from China's perspective. But there's also been a concern, and again, actually this feeds into the CPEC question as well, that it's essential to maintain not just a kind of some element of balance on the nuclear side, but on the conventional side as well, and that China needs to be able to kind of step in and play that role for Pakistan, because also none of the other partners for Pakistan are going to be as reliable in occupying this role. You've had kind of the benign situation in which you get a kind of perfect symmetry between what the US and China are doing, and you see, I mean, you have these great exchanges where Deng Xiaoping is urging the US to send superior equipment, saying, you know, the Chinese equipment's no good, essentially. You need to send your best stuff to Pakistan, in the early 80s and things. So there are points where that works in sort of nice symmetry from China's perspective, and then there's points where there's a real squeeze, and China sees itself as kind of the only actor that will ensure that Pakistan at kind of highly sensitive junctures has what it needs. And so how the nature of that and what China's felt it has to do has then varied in light of the strategic context, in light of India's capabilities, in light of the US-India relationship, in light of internal developments in Pakistan, in light of what China itself is able to offer. And so you can look at these kind of different junctures in terms of, as you say, the kind of hardening of capabilities, and why is this the focus at this particular juncture? How essential is China to this? There are periods in which it's sort of, you know, fades out or just plays an important technical role, and then there's periods in which it plays a much more critical one. I would also just on your first comment as well. I think the interesting kind of thing about the relationship, when I was writing the book, and one of the reasons I wrote it in the first place was there was so little at the time that had kind of pulled together all of the different strands, that lots of material was out there on each of the individual areas and topics and things, but it was striking to me that such an important relationship for both sides and for thinking through the region, you didn't just have a sort of repository of all of that stitched together in one place. And so I don't think a huge amount of it is particularly original. It's not a thesis-driven book either. A lot of it, I hope, just compiles as much the material that others have assembled over the years in a way that is a sort of jumping off point for some of the thinking about the relationship. And I think it really, I mean, of course, we've seen all this additional flux since then, particularly with CPEC and all of the developments since 2015. But it has been almost a sort of under-theorized relationship for people who are looking at this on the Chinese foreign policy side, on the Chinese side, and to some extent, except in these very discrete areas, nuclear balance, military conventional balance, some of these things, just in terms of the overall scheme of the role that the relationship occupies in the region. But that was in 2015. There's been so much more interest and engagement and thinking about the relationship since then that I think it's now a much richer conversation than was possible when when I first put it together.
Thank you, Andrew, for asking that question. I think Ali will join us back in the conversation. He's having some connectivity issues. I cannot see you here. So I will just move to a question by the audience and then we'll get Ali back into the conversation. So one of the questions that's been posted for you by one of our attendees, it's a mix of questions. So I'm going to pose it to you. So just, pen it down at your end and then you can answer those questions. So, China also is vying for influence inside Afghanistan. And the question is that, do you see that whether China and Pakistan in Afghanistan are heading for cooperation or conflict vis-a-vis their influence in Afghanistan? Secondly, what do you think about China's non-interference policy towards Pakistan? Is there a non-interference policy, or is this, or was that, although you discussed that in your book, but if you can comment on it? And then the same attendee has asked, what is the US factor in Sino-Pak ties? If you can comment on that. And finally, is China a party to the Kashmir issue? So overall, just a mix of questions here. I would move to you to please answer these. Thank you.
Okay, they're good questions. I'll answer a couple at more length than others, because I think they're quite germane to a lot of what's going to be playing out in the relationship and the region really in the next few years. So I can say very briefly, China is a party to the Kashmir issue unquestionably, and it has been striking after Article 370 and things to see. China tries to duck the issue, has tried to duck the issue for some time. It's not ducking the issue at the moment, and we can talk about what that amounts to. But I think there is a different role that China is now playing on these questions than had been the case really, again, for decades before. But I'm going to leave that for now to take on a couple of the other things. Afghanistan first, conflict or competition. As I kind of mentioned in the remarks earlier, there isn't the kind of clean symmetry of views between Pakistan and China on Afghanistan that there is on in kind of underlying structural ways with India. There have been points at which the balance of interests and the kind of end states, intermediate states and things that Pakistan has wanted to see and that China's wanted to see have not been identical. China historically deferred to Pakistan on its Afghanistan policy, even, and again, from interlocutors on the Chinese side have even virtually said that they outsourced their Afghanistan policy to Pakistan for a period of time. After a certain juncture, particularly after it became clear that the US was drawing down in Afghanistan, I think that became less true. And there was certainly a period of some, not tensions, but that you would get dissonance between China and Pakistan, even at some of the international forums in which the issue would be addressed. China is overwhelmingly focused on stability, counter Uyghur concerns, all of this sort of thing, and that's it. It doesn't. I mean, for all the other issues that one might think about vis-a-vis Afghanistan, copper mine, or significance in terms of trade routes in the region, things, it's very, very securitized from China's perspective. The other goals are very much subordinated to that, and so they had a fairly single-minded focus on on that objective? Can you reach a stable political settlement? And is there a context emerging in Afghanistan that is not going to have an invidious impact on China's security interests, particularly vis-a-vis Xinjiang? In a sense, you have now reached a stage again where you have a degree of sync between how the two sides are approaching the issue. Both sides are, of course, agreed on the peace process, all of this, but you still have a degree of mistrust that's there on China's part, that at points Pakistan may have other priorities in Afghanistan in terms of the relative balance of what it wants to see there, that there's more comfort with certain groups that China is not comfortable with. China is less worried about Indian activities, frankly, in Afghanistan than Pakistan. I mean, I think there's a big gap in threat perceptions when it comes to the Indian role there. I think China's been quite clear about that. I think after a certain point, there was a strong sense, both on the Chinese side and the Pakistani side, that if there were differences over these issues, they should be thrashed out in private as on other questions. And the two sides have largely been joined up in public on this in the last few years. But I don't think there is an identity of views on the kind of some of these underlying preferences, structural issues. I don't think there'll be conflict, certainly. I think it's too, China needs Pakistan still on Afghanistan. It's the only country that it can really rely on. It's still heavily reliant for its intelligence on some of these groups on Pakistan, and so the cooperation will still be quite close, but with sort of some reservations and question marks on China's part as well. On the non-interference question, I don't really believe in the non-interference policy exactly. I think China involves itself in different ways politically in contexts when it has to secure its interests, and the definition of those interests has grown more expansive over time. I certainly don't think, I mean, the book itself opens with La Masjid. I don't think that is an example of Chinese non-interference. If China thinks that there are certain interests that are at stake, threatened, or it simply wants to kind of tilt things in a direction that is more conducive to its interests, it will involve itself. It doesn't mean it kind of interferes in a way that is necessarily politically uncomfortable on the scale that you might see from certain other countries, but China's a protagonist on this, and it has views as well for how it wants to see internal developments in Pakistan evolving, not least because its economic interests are so closely bound up in these things as well. And you can see that over questions around the management of CPEC and other things too. And again, we can discuss the details of that a bit more. And very finally, on the US factor, so I'd said that, which I think has been true almost throughout, that it has been a kind of non-competitive relationship in the past. There's been a long-term view that is, and that China has consistently expressed, if relations between Pakistan and the US are at a lower ebb, China encourages the two sides to fix things. Again, because of the underlying structure of the relationship, there are certain, this is seen to be working to China's advantage. That it's no longer clear that this is as true. The last year has represented an important shift in that regard as a result of the wider dynamics in the US-China relationship. It's started to, I think, pose in some ways more challenges for Pakistan as a result of that, because it's been starting to become harder to sort of straddle the two sides as comfortably. I think the sort of push that you had, particularly in the last year on Pakistan's part, to kind of fix elements of the relationship with the US, China viewed with more suspicion than had historically been the case for comparable efforts. And on the US part, of course, you had the very critical remarks on CPEC from Alice Wells last year, and again when she came to Pakistan. I think the sense on the US side is much more that South Asia is not, South Asia is also going to be an environment in which US-China competition plays out significantly. It's not going to be exempt from it. Yes, there's a different balance of priorities that the US has in the region and that China has in the region that had meant that on some issues they were able to be relatively cooperative, including on Afghanistan. But the stakes and the scale of the overall competition that's now playing out between the US and China is starting to make that much harder. And the competition specifically around the Belt and Road has some clear implications for CPEC. In particular, the US, it's very hard for the US to be going around and saying the BRI is predatory, the BRI is a problem for countries, and then have the flagship CPEC sort of exempt from this, because the US was relatively relaxed about CPEC. In some ways, it was very quietly, it wouldn't do it in public, but it was relatively supportive of some of the impetus behind it in the first instance. Now, some of that assessment has shifted as it has actually seen it play out in practice, but some of it is also a factor of the overall competition that's playing out between the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy on the US part, and really all of these as kind of subsets of the wider competition that's playing out. So there was always going to be a point in which I think CPEC came into the crosshairs, not because the US is going to try and do anything practically that would be harmful, but I think there will be a continued push to highlight some of the problems and issues in what is the flagship, or China doesn't call it quite as much as it used to, of the Belt and Road as a whole. So of course it's going to, on the kind of, in a sense, informational battle that's taking place, of course CPEC's going to play a role in that. I think it was always going to be hard to sustain this kind of this ambiguous status that it had for the period from 2015 to last year.
All right, thank you so much for taking on these questions and touching upon all those angles which are extremely important for our discussion. We have several questions about Kashmir, which I'm going to just lump together, so you can make a note of it. Is there any strategic impact on Kashmir issue of the China-India standoff, the current standoff? Secondly, one of the attendees asked that recently a Chinese government spokesperson said that China would help Pakistan defend its legitimate rights and interests in the Kashmir region. So can Chinese backing of Pakistan in Kashmir be a real possibility? How do you see that? So over to you, Andrew.
So I think there's a real challenge for China on this, in that it really does try to be quite careful in separating out dynamics on the Sino-Indian front and dynamics between Pakistan and India, and it has seen the Kashmir issue as, in different ways, super radioactive, has really tried to avoid it politically as far as humanly possible. So when it comes to the kind of practical support, again, going back to the historic basis of things, kind of supporting Pakistan with capabilities, fine. Practical support in kind of an immediate tactical context or anything like that, or even kind of linkage, would be, I still think, very difficult to imagine. One of the specific concerns, of course, that China has is because this has been, when the issue is raised of, what steps could Pakistan take in Kashmir in a context in which the Sino-Indian border thing is playing out? From the Chinese perspective on this, if it is seen that there are linked or associated moves going on, there's any sort of active kind of effectively multi-front cooperation taking place in a context like this, I think it is seen to be crossing a line from the Chinese perspective. So I think there will be the defending Pakistan's interests and things like that diplomatically, yes. In terms of the kind of practical elements of some of these questions on the ground, I think it is seen to be extremely risky for China, because it would, I think, prompt certain other moves on India's part, if that were the case. There's still, even, I mean, if you look, I mean, we'll see what happens even on a, it's not directly linked in one sense, but even Diamond Basha at China until recently has been treading carefully on this, because there is still the sensitivity about Gilgit-Baltistan. So does it get left out of CPEC if it all goes ahead, or blah, blah. I mean, there is still a concern about what certain of these moves might amount to, because India does have other choices in terms of the steps that it can take, not just in, you know, the border and otherwise, but in relations with the US, on other issues vis-a-vis China. There are a lot of things that would follow if some of these lines were crossed, and you had something that looked like a much more kind of active, convergent, multi-front security cooperation. And China has for so long been insisting that this is not the case, and that these things are handled on separate bilateral channels. And so I still think there will be an aversion to that. But kind of caveat on all of this, and it goes to the question that you raised at the beginning, and I answered in a very kind of wide, sweeping way about what China's doing. I think we do have to look at the possibility generally that some of these inhibitions on China's part at some point sort of no longer hold. I think there is a reason that relates to Sino-Indian, the Sino-Indian relationship, that means that they probably will in this case. But I think when looking out on a whole series of different questions now, we do also have to consider the possibility that certain like fixtures in the way that China's thought about these issues may, for some reasons that relate to these other dynamics and that relate to China thinks it can get away with different things that it couldn't in the past. It's willing to take certain risks that it wasn't in the past. And in any of these contexts, one has to look at the possibility that the calculation tilts, and that there are certain moves that China could decide to take that are different from what we'd seen in the past. And if that were the case in this instance, there are a whole series of things that we could talk about in terms of what that might amount to. I don't think it's there yet. I think China was still, even on the diplomatic side, I think it took a little bit of pushing to get them to come out in the place that they came out. The caution is still there, but we are in a different space on a lot of these issues now.
All right, thank you so much. We have Ali back. Just a sec. Ali, you need to turn it on at your end, or please ask the question.
Sorry for the hiccup, Andrew. In your book, you term Pakistan as the central plank of China's transition from a regional power to a global power. Now that underscores the
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the audio. I'm sorry for this. The last thing I heard was about transition from regional power to global power.
What we'll do is Andrew will ask Ali to write down his question, because I think he has some issues with the connectivity. We will now move to Hassan. Hassan, you can please ask the question that the audience is asking.
Okay. So Andrew, we have a question about the outbreak of the COVID-19. So the question is that in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, the Western powers got an opportunity to contain Chinese power more aggressively. So we all know how smartly PLA and CCP play its diplomacy. What do you think? If Western powers cannot contain China, do you think they could go after China's best ally? Is it a threat for Pakistan?
You can mute yourself.
So, I mean, I would say that in the first instance, there was, I wouldn't say there's been a particularly significant push in the kind of immediate phase when the crisis was playing out in China to kind of enact a different set of measures on the US part or others in response to it. I'm not sure I necessarily saw a kind of I saw impetus at that point to, I mean, you had some slightly poorly conceived remarks about how this would be a benefit for the US because jobs would come to the US. I mean, you had some of this sort of language used, but you didn't have new moves on the US side to kind of sort of, as it were, take advantage of a moment of vulnerability. I would say the moves that you've seen coming on the US side have been more recent. I mean, it's been actually at a juncture in which the crisis, the pandemic here has hit incredibly hard, and it's been as much in a framework in which the US-China dynamics have worsened as a result of the pandemic. There's no question, but I would say that they've worsened at a moment in which the US itself has taken more of a hit, an internal hit, as a result of really its own handling of the pandemic. It's cleared the way for certain moves. The political context that shift as a result of it has cleared the way for certain moves that had maybe been held up before, had maybe been reluctance to move as forcefully on them. I'm thinking particularly of the kind of the level of technology restrictions that are now being applied, some of the targeting of Huawei and things like that has really accelerated in the last month or so. But I'd say it's been more the case that China, once it had got past its own kind of peak phase of the pandemic, has tended to be the actor that has kind of stepped out in a more significant way to kind of both a mix of defensive interests in trying to ensure that it's not that it's not blamed, that the internal issues that were there over the kind of first phase, the cover up and all of these sorts of things, China's not held culpable for this, but also to a certain extent, I'd say there's been more of a taking advantage on China's part of the fact that other actors are heavily distracted by what's going on and the internal focus on the pandemic, which is unusual for China. I mean, if you go back to the global financial crisis, to take a really obvious example, China didn't do anything that resembled what we've been seeing, on its borders or kind of diplomatically or kind of on the information propaganda side in the way that we've seen during this crisis. It's been quite strikingly different the way that China has approached this, where in the global financial crisis, China played a very discreet China played a very helpful behind the scenes role to help stabilize the global economy. It was a very different balance. And of course, some of this reflects US-China dynamics. Some of it reflects the fact that China under Xi Jinping is a very different actor. Some of it, there are a number of things that are fed into this. But I certainly don't see a kind of impetus on the US or other parts to go after Pakistan or something as a result of this. I think there's a lot that's directed at China itself and will continue to be directed on a series of different fronts, as much on the economic and technology side as anything else. And that those elements will intensify. And then, as I sort of mentioned before, I think you are going to have this continued critical approach in looking at issues like CPAC, Belt and Road, and things like that. But there's still, there is still an important agenda, for instance, in Afghanistan at the moment that needs to be addressed. I don't think Pakistan will be seen as the most effective way for the US to kind of target China or something. The tools in kind of counter-China measures when it comes to Pakistan from the US perspective, I think are actually relatively limited. There are many other environments in which the US can take steps that are very consequential and problematic for China. I think that's much less the case when it comes to Pakistan.
Thank you so much. We have Ali back again. We're gonna attempt this one more time. Over to you.
Hi, sorry for the hiccup again. So in your book, you write about Pakistan being the central plank of China's transition from a regional power to a global power, and both countries realized this importance and centrality. Now we see that the US and China are headed towards competition, and that too, which is marked by an euphemism of Cold War, the new Cold War. Considering that, and considering the imbalance on the competition cooperation pendulum, how do you look at the challenges and opportunities for Pak-China relations in the Indian Ocean going forward, especially when we look at the evolving Indo-Pacific strategy that involves a heavy Indian footprint in the region? So I want your thoughts on that. And secondly, I want to digress a bit and take the question towards crisis management. So while in DC last year, I heard a lot of officials talk about China's role in the Pulwama Balakot crisis as being escalatory. That boggled us all as to how and what role could have China played that had compelled the US policymakers to talk about it being an escalatory role in the very crisis. So I want your thoughts on these two questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and I'm glad you were able to materialize properly. So on the second piece, this then goes to a kind of a wider set of questions on the US-China dynamics in South Asia, US-India relations, China-Pakistan relations. So I think it's quite important beyond the specific case as well. One of the few areas that the US and China had historically been able to cooperate on in the region really consistently over time was crisis management, particularly specifically if it appeared that there might be an escalation of sorts between India and Pakistan. And you can go through a series of the crises. The roles varied, the utility of what China was doing varied, who was the kind of lead protagonist, what was required has varied considerably. But what you did have, and I talked to a number of the officials involved on both sides who were there through these different junctures. You had this channel which was there was a way of managing it. It was a sort of slightly weirdly G2-ish kind of thing almost at certain points. But there was a view that there was an absolutely consistent and shared interest in what the outcome was, and that both sides should play a kind of not purely even-handed, but in light of their relative relationships, there was kind of discrete and specific roles that they could play. I think that particularly since Uri has been less true, because I think this then goes into the kind of longer term tilt and kind of clearer tilt that you're then having on the two sides. I think Uri was the first point in which the needed to be, and the sense on the US part was that there needed to be a clearer kind of tilt towards the positions taken, support extended, and things to India. And I think that's in different ways been true since. That the kind of sort of pseudo even-handedness thing that you'd had in the past was not in given the nature of the US-India relationship was no longer something that the US should pursue. It wasn't consistent with where they needed the relationship to be. It wasn't consistent with Indian expectations, and that had to change. And that was the first point at which I think you really got that. And that's, of course, going back to the Obama administration. What that has meant on China's part is that there has, in a certain sense, been a question of whether there needs to be a sort of compensatory tilt as well. I mean, do you handle the relationship? Do you handle these kind of things in the same way, or do you handle them from the perspective that the US and India are going to be cooperating and relating to these contexts in a way that was not the case in 2001, 2008, whatever other sort of context that you need to look at. So when you then have a situation, so how then, from a US perspective, how helpful is China in these kinds of situations, or how far does on China's part, does it believe that it has to play a different kind of role diplomatically in terms of the forms of support that might be extended to Pakistan, these sorts of things? I think the balance there does look different. The term escalatory that you use, I certainly heard kind of unhelpful or something along those lines. I hadn't necessarily always heard it expressed as strongly as escalatory in the context, but I think it is the case that now, then, and in future, the balance of the role that China plays in these things will look a bit different, and the balance of the US-China exchanges on this will and do look different from the way these crises had played out in the past. On the Indian Ocean side, so I mean, I'd say there are also two elements to the kind of what it is for Pakistan to occupy this kind of role as a partner for China. One is the actual practical elements of the cooperation in terms of the utility of Pakistani port facilities, which to me is still at the moment largely Karachi rather than Gwadar, and certain forms of cooperation that might take place. Obviously, there are the actual sales and development of naval assets and these sorts of things. China is still a certain way away on the Indian Ocean writ large. It's still kind of advancing its capabilities. It's able to do things now that it wasn't able to before, but we're not in the kind of context, it's not the US, and it's not the kind of the power that it is in the Pacific, and that's going to, this will shift gradually over time, but quite slowly. The other element, though, of this is this question of the kind of model as well, because Pakistan, the relationship with Pakistan, I think, is intended to be a model for other countries in terms of being a security relationship that falls short of being a formal alliance, but has is a trusted military and security relationship of a kind that could be replicated in other cases. And this is a relationship that in the Indian Ocean more generally, I think China would like to replicate. I mean, if you're looking in the overall map of things, I still think there are a lot of challenges for China when it comes to doing any of this in the immediate neighborhood, the Maldives or Sri Lanka or obviously Bangladesh or something like that. But of course, the first other set of facilities that it has, the first overseas base that it has in Djibouti, if you're looking other locations in East Africa, there are going to be kind of a wider set of moves on China's part to develop and use certain facilities differently, and where Pakistan matters to China not just as a kind of how far can the two sides cooperate in practical terms in the Indian Ocean, but also how far can the cooperation that takes place between the two sides be something that is replicated in other instances. And you've certainly seen a kind of big stepping up of kind of PLA, military diplomacy kind of efforts to this effect in a number of Indian Ocean countries. And I think, as far as I'm aware, you have some degree of coordination between China and Pakistan on, what this might amount to, sharing of information, a whole series of these sorts of things, which I'm sure will continue as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew, for answering all that questions. So there are a lot of questions out there. What I'm going to do is just lump all of them together again. And if you could make a note of them, and then you can get back to them. So first is, U.S. Opposition to CPEC. And one of the attendees wants to know, is that now happening because of Indian pressure? Because of this Indo-US strategic alignment, is there a pressure from India on the US, or is this opposition independent of any Indian pressure? Another question deals with the civil-military relations in Pakistan and as to how China manages that relationship. I would be interested in your answer for that question as well. Another question from our attendee is that how do you see the dynamics of US-China relationship change under a Biden administration? And do you foresee then a change in the opposition to CPEC as well, with respect to, as an extension of that? Another question is about US departure from the Middle East, and do you see Pakistan as a springboard that China can use in order to increase its influence in the Middle East? So I'll stop here for a while, and I'll give you the floor to answer these questions.
Again, really good questions, really kind of, again, at the nub of what we're likely to, the big issues that we're likely to see playing out in the next stretch. So first of all, the CPEC question. So I sit in Washington and sit in on a bunch of the discussions that have taken place on the Belt and Road and CPEC and things like this over time. There was not a huge amount of interest, frankly, in the Belt and Road in the first instance. China was going around everywhere else, offering these kind of new packages and things. The US had tended to see China questions through a much more kind of traditional kind of framework of, the sort of military competition and balancing taking place in the Asia Pacific. There are forms of economic cooperation, BRI, how much significance to attach to it, sort of debatable. It may be helpful in certain countries, it may not. You did have in the kind of the early stages of the kind of discussions on CPEC, you had points in which, because India was raising the CPEC question quite consistently, you would have a little bit of mirroring of the language here, because India was raising this at the top levels, not just as a, I mean, this was something that senior cabinet officials and things going to India from the US side would hear, and they would mirror back some of the concerns that were being expressed there. And I think one of the most obvious examples was some of the statements from General Mattis. But I would still say the balance of views on CPEC was, might have some benefits. The US had been encouraging China to play a more significant economic role in Pakistan before. So it would have been a little bit difficult after spending several years saying, Pakistan has an energy crisis, and China says, well, so we're now going in and largely in CPEC, taking on a lot of the energy issues in Pakistan, and to then immediately flip and say, well, that's a problem and this is a sort of strategic concern or something like that. The hinge point is not, I think, the India dynamic. The India dynamic affected in the early years the willingness, I think, on the US part to look sort of cooperatively, particularly in public at CPEC. The hinge point is the shift in the balance of the overall US approach to start seeing a lot more of these economic and technology questions in competitive terms. So the point at which you start getting the critical language used about CPEC in the first instance is the point in which the US launches the economic component of its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Essentially, the kind of how does the US offer alternatives to countries? How does it sort of counterbalance the Belt and Road through economic means? That's the first point at which you have the kind of critical public statements from Pompeo, most notably, and then you have a rolling out on the Belt and Road virtually everywhere of this kind of more critical view, telling countries that, you know, they should be more wary of what China's up to, and debt traps and predatory, you know, all of this sort of thing that's being talked about. If anything, CPEC was one of the last, and South Asia was one of the last places in which this happened, that you started having this kind of rolled out as openly. And I think one of the reasons for that, honestly, is because I do not think that has actually been as critical a view of some of China's activities in this regard. There is a critical view, but it's, you know, it's kind of 70-30 or 60-40 or something like that. There are other environments in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in the Asia Pacific, virtually everywhere else, the US had been out very publicly and critically on the Belt and Road and what was being undertaken there. So I wouldn't say it was pushed by India, and I wouldn't say I'd say it's not a kind of excessively oppositional position. I still think it's quite tempered in certain respects, which then kind of going on to the Biden question, which as it relates to CPEC. So very briefly on the bigger picture, sort of how do things change under Biden vis-a-vis the US-China relationship? I think that the kind of the line that you would hear from people on the kind of, you know, Biden's Asia people and things is that the US approach to China through this administration has been confrontational without being competitive. Like, the efforts to compete with China have not been sufficiently effective in a whole series of different regards. That there hasn't been enough focus on the kind of domestic elements, you know, research capability, science and technology, a whole series of the things that you would need to resource if you're going to be competing with China in a technology-centered competition, that it's been insufficiently ally-centric, that it's been done very unilaterally. There hasn't been a kind of coalition marshaled on the US part on, for instance, the trade space. It's all been done through direct bilateral measures. And there are a few other differences as well. But one of the differences I would also say is, I think it is believed that there is more cooperative space than has existed during this administration. It is limited. It is much more limited than was the case during the Obama administration, for instance. But there are going to be specific issue areas, climate change being one of the most obvious, but possibly, I think, even on the kind of, it will be interesting to see if you look at a specific issue such as Afghanistan, which was a sort of area of cooperation, whether some of these are more likely to be sort of almost exempt from the kind of competitive dynamics, where you get an approach that says, yes, in the grand scheme of things, there is going to be global competition rolling out. There is bipartisan support for that. The Biden people think this as well. That's certainly the case. But are there going to be areas in which the hierarchy of concerns just looks different? It's not going to be an area that's worth kind of focusing on. You have to pick in the competition, and there are going to be areas in which there are, you know, limited areas of congruence, even of interest. And so Afghanistan to me is one of the sort of examples of that. And CPEC, I think you're still going to get the view that is, there is a competition taking place that isn't just about kind of practical elements of this, it's kind of reputational. CPEC is going to matter reputationally. There is still going to be a kind of, I think, a more critical line taken on CPEC, because I think it does have an important reputational role for the Belt and Road as a whole. And I certainly think that the sense that certain forms of economic competition, connectivity competition and things are going to be important under a Biden administration, I think that's still going to be there. But I still wouldn't overweight how much CPEC is seen in kind of problematic or critical terms in a Pakistani case. I think it's in a global reputational case. Yes, in terms of, is the US practically going to do anything? How concerned is the US practically about the implications of CPEC in Pakistan? I still debate how significant that is or is likely to be. And certainly you could have, I think you will have a rhetorical shift under a Biden administration that may mean that you get tonally different things on China from what you'd had before. Could be the case for some of the Belt and Road questions and CPEC as well. Civil military relations in Pakistan. This has been particularly interesting during the lifetime of CPEC in the last 2 to 3 years. Let me wind back slightly before that, though. I still remember not long after Musharraf fell, going and seeing some kind of interlocutors on the Chinese side who were just really not very happy about the kind of constellation of civilian power and the kind of confusing picture that they had emerging in the aftermath. They liked having a single point of kind of decision making. They don't like messiness in the system. They like to have consistent partners over time who can get things done and deliver for them. And the closest relationships, notwithstanding some of the historic relations that certain Pakistani political parties and individuals have had with China as well, has always been with the army. So there is a sort of, they're happy enough and in some cases often have a preference for a certain version of what the civil military balance looks like. The interesting thing under the PMLN was that, I mean, really at the same time, the military can't run all the details of all of these projects going down to the levels that they need to be run at. I mean, you have to have much closer forms of civilian cooperation. And what you saw under the PMLN was that there was a much greater depth and level of exposure at so many different levels when the PMLN were in power, in ways that were not always smiled on by the Pakistani army, frankly. One of the problems that we've then seen since for CPEC is that China, again, wanted continuity. I think it was very clear that it would have liked, I mean, if you wind back to 2017, China wanted continuity of government. CPEC was, from their perspective, working pretty well at that point. There were all sorts of difficulties and things, but they thought that they had a government in place that could kind of execute it, had the intention to execute on it, whatever failings they had. Then we saw what played out with Nawaz Sharif, and we saw what played out in the last elections. And then they were left with a government that they were not, frankly, super happy with in the first instance, who had made very critical remarks in terms of specific ministers, including after taking office, on CPEC, where they had not been comfortable in different ways with how the PTI had dealt with CPEC during the preceding years, and then they didn't like the manner in which it had been brought about, because they thought that they'd made this long-term bet, CPEC was going to be the big strategic priority, blah, 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 and then it was their closest friends who were then engaged in this kind of internal confrontation, which, as far as they were concerned, meant that the partners that they had found to be pretty good on their economic issues were suddenly thrown out, and they were dealing with a much more difficult and confusing picture. What then happened afterwards was they had to decide how far do we deal with the civilian government in its own right, or how far do we go to our traditional friends and figure out how to deal with things that way. And the approach, I think, after the first few months, which were difficult, was we need to, I think, work more closely again with the Pakistani army directly on a lot of these issues, including in kind of squashing some problems that they were having on CPEC. And of course, you now, as we're going into a sort of effectively a mini revival of CPEC, the interlocutors that they have been working with most closely in kind of getting that impetus, the model of the CPEC authority, all of these sorts of things, a model that had been quite resisted during the PMLN time, now is kind of tilted back in the other direction. And I think they also thought that they had made some almost mistakes in creating the perception that there might be parallel tracks. I mean, they're perfectly happy, as I say, to deal with the Pakistani army. Pakistani army has been the one that they've trusted to deliver for them before. There would have been a model in place, going back several years that could have worked perfectly well from that perspective there as well. But it's been civil military issues have played a far more important role in the last few years than they ever would traditionally. China would have just sat all of this out. It wouldn't have made any difference, but it did have a practical difference in terms of what was actually playing out with CPEC, and they have expressed preferences when it's come to this. So that's what I'd say on that. I can go into more on that if you're interested. Much more briefly then, sorry to answer these at such length. The US departure from the Middle East, China's operated very, very cautiously in the Middle East. It's been an environment in which, because they have essentially this sort of uniquely good set of relations with virtually every actor in the Middle East. They've good relations with Israel, they have good relations with Turkey, they have good relations with Saudi, they have good relations with Iran, they have good relations with Egypt, and they're the kind of the key countries from the Chinese perspective and their traditional thinking on the Middle East. There've been forms of involvement, therefore, that they have been very careful about. They have not wanted to play particularly active, not just military role, but even political role, because this kind of delicate balance, it's quite easy for the whole thing to fall apart very, very quickly if they're seen as too much of a kind of a party to these things. We almost saw that in Afghanistan, where they had a good relations with all the different parties in Afghanistan, and then they started playing a much more active diplomatic role and started coming in for a lot more criticism, including for the reason that they were seen to be operating in such, at certain points, close lockstep with Pakistan. If they start playing a more active diplomatic, political role, even in the Middle East in a more serious way, there are real risks for them. So there's been a level of concern about stepping that up at all. The long-term repercussions of the US drawdown do mean, however, that it is going to be an environment in which, much as was the case in Afghanistan, China may simply feel that it has to step up in different ways to ensure that certain developments are tilted in a direction that is more favorable to their interests. And there's a sort of ineluctable logic that starts to suck you in different ways once that's the case. They're still going to be hugely dependent on Middle Eastern energy resources in a way that the US is now not. And the US, they've effectively benefited in different ways from protection of sea lines of communication that the US has provided. I mean, there's been a sort of security guarantee of sorts that the Asian powers in particular, including China, have been among the most important beneficiaries of. But as the US role moves, and the drawdown there, and a drawdown, of course, that is also intended as part of the US ramping up in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific theater, is something that China's going to have to think more seriously about when it comes at least to being able to deal with some of the most practical issues, protection of sea lanes, protection of their nationals, and some of that's already been underway. The risk for China, of course, though, in this is, and this has always been the kind of concern about, even going back to the rebalance to Asia or the pivot to Asia, the US draws down in these regions in order to focus more intensely on China. China then comes under pressure to escalate its role in precisely the areas in which it was that were seen as kind of a trap, as a liability, as a suck on resources, in order to manage its interests better there. There's still a lot of concern on China's part that they don't make that mistake, that they don't get excessively sucked in different ways. And so I still think there'll be a lot of caution there. Of course, and this goes back to the very original question, Pakistan will have a role to play. It's always had a role to play in China's relations in the Islamic world writ large and the Middle East specifically, and this will be practically true as it's looking out militarily and in other areas. Of course, nowadays versus the 80s or so on, China has its own strong bilateral relations with some of the specific countries, but I certainly think it's one of the places where, again, if you're looking at countries that you can count on and that can be helpful in different ways, then Pakistan is going to be one of the main actors there, and we've seen that in diplomatic environments. We've seen that at the OIC. We've seen that in other contexts, and so I certainly think if they do start kind of stepping up again, which will be slow but may well start to happen, then Pakistan will play its part in that.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for such comprehensive replies. And especially on the civil military side, I would use a cricket analogy. If you play cricket, that you've hit for a six, and baseball, that you've hit for a home run with that answer. So thank you for elaborating on that. We have now moved to the last round of questions, and given that time is also needs to be managed, I would ask Hassan to now take 2 questions from the list, and then I'll pose the last 2 questions to you from the emails that I received, and then we will wrap up the session. So over to you, Hassan. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. Sure, there are 3-4 questions that I would try to sum up in one single question. That is about the China's sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific. The question people are asking here are about that there are almost around 40 countries that will be linked by the BRI. So is there any prospect, or is there any chance that those 40 countries together make a conglomerate, or they adopt the operational pattern of a regional organization, and that could aid China and create a Chinese version of regional and global policing? So this is question 1. And the other question is about the militant equation. So there's a question that if Chinese and Pakistanis can talk to one another's militant groups, why can't they talk to their own homegrown militant groups? So that's all.
So on the kind of sphere of influence and the BRI question, I think countries have got smarter about the BRI, generally speaking, in the last few years. This sort of connectivity competition that's playing out, the new resources that are coming on stream from all sorts of different sources, the US is gradually starting to mobilize resources, but Japan has made significant commitments. India, in its immediate neighborhood, has made commitments that to certain countries like the Maldives or something like that are really very consequential, even if the resources are far less in the global scheme of things, say, than that China has available. Australia's made some new commitments. The Europeans are putting in new resources. I think in most cases, with a very small number of exceptions, there are countries that now want to be able to have it both ways with all of this. They want to be able to take in new sources of financing, play actors off against each other a little bit. We've seen that, of course, in for instance, the return of the Rajapaksas essentially in Sri Lanka. You look at how a new government there, with the relationship with China that they had before, but they're able to benefit both from some Chinese resources, from some new resources from the Indian side. I don't think you have a situation, and this is true on lots of the elements of the US-China competition. Countries want to be able to benefit in different ways from both sides. With a narrow list of exceptions, existing allies, or on the Chinese side, a smaller group of countries. I don't think countries for the most part want to lock in that way, and certainly the BRI itself doesn't provide in its own right enough of a basis for that. I mean, I think there will be, as we've kind of mentioned, certain forms of stepping up of security cooperation with all sorts of countries on other tracks, whether it's got a BRI related hat or not. BRI does put conditions in place, including in the development of specific facilities that can play into this as well. There are going to be kind of broader spheres of influence question, particularly when it comes to things like technology infrastructure, where there are real implications as to whether you have your telecoms network and your fiber optic cables and your satellites and things like that. Whether these are in a kind of China camp or another camp. I mean, and these have security implications as well. So it's not that these economics and technology dimensions don't play into this over time, and there aren't different ways in which these spheres of influence will develop. But I certainly don't think you get, for most countries, I think the intention will still be to move relatively fluidly between these political and economic frameworks rather than locking in. We can name the countries that may have to lock in, but I still think that's the number is going to be small. And I think even some of the countries that are closest to China find that when you're excessively close, you don't have as much room for maneuver, that it's not very helpful for your relationship with China as well. And you're better off with some other options in play, and this includes Pakistan, certainly. On the militancy question, they can talk to one another's militant groups. I mean, I think so. There's the militancy question for China in terms of the groups that are kind of actual terrorist groups, because of course China bunches all sorts of groups together that and claims all sorts of things of terrorist activities that are absolutely not. And so at any point in talking about this, one has to be careful about what is being kind of put together in this equation. But there are groups that by any definition would fall into the category of being militant or terrorist groups. And there's one set in particular, the TIP, where there is no serious exchange that either the Chinese side or the Pakistani side has had. I mean, they've been on a sort of they've been on a list of groups that are simply to be targeted. Now, this has been a point of sensitivity at junctures between China and Pakistan, because there've been slight blurring of the lines on this. TIP were operating in Haqqani-controlled territory in Fatah for a while, and then even when they were displaced into Afghanistan, were in some points operating in Haqqani camps and things like that. So there've been points at which there's been concerns from China's part that certain groups, specifically the TIP, are it's not that Pakistan is going and having particularly exchanges with them, although there've been some claims made to China to that effect. But rather the level of kind of commitment to eliminating these groups has not always been what China has wanted. I think Zhao Bayazov made a big difference to that. I think it really did remove what had been a kind of significant irritant between the two sides in that regard. And the issue has, I think, receded from the bilateral relationship after that was the case. But if you look at what China's doing in Afghanistan, for instance, with regard to these groups, you have seen this kind of direct, either military or paramilitary presence. There are more efforts to deal directly with Afghanistan, and in terms of the presence of some of the groups, in particular in Badakhshan. There are other groups where China with Pakistani facilitation has always been willing to talk to them, and of course the Taliban relationship has been one that has been particularly important in that regard, the Afghan Taliban, and that continues to be the case. China's, I think it's still one of the roles that I think China sees Pakistan, China sees Pakistan's role as important, and I think that will continue to be the case. If you're referring to, if the questioner, I now realize, might also be referring to BLA or something like this. Yes, China has had very limited interactions with Baluch groups, as far as I'm aware, largely outside the country. But kind of, I wouldn't put too much weight on them. This kind of information, it's been relatively low key. I know there was a big piece that claimed that this amounted to more than that, and I don't have all the information on everything that's gone on there. But I wouldn't, when you compare it to, for instance, the really serious processes that you've had with the Taliban and things, and then you look at are the Chinese officials who can go and attend meetings that Baluch groups hold in London or Geneva or something like that. I don't think they're kind of a like for like.
All right. With this, we come to the last two questions for you, Andrew. The first question is about China-UK relationship, and the question is that in October 2019 there were high-profile visits by the royal family in Pakistan, and earlier March this year, the British High Commissioner in Pakistan, said that UK would explore potential investments in such areas as clean energy, combating climate change, health, education, tourism, without naming CPEC. And recently, very recently, we have seen that UK government appears to have changed its position on Huawei's 5G investment inside Britain. They've also adopted a principled stand against Hong Kong's new security laws, threatening to provide pathways to citizenship for 3 million Hong Kong residents. This has led to China's ambassador to the UK threatening UK off consequences. So with these tensions running high between UK and China, what could these changes mean for UK's investment in CPEC projects? So your views on that. And lastly, so in Pakistan, when CPEC was launched, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories going on, a lot of myths associated with what China's real agenda with investment in Pakistan is. And a lot of people, started to talk about Pakistan's colonization or China being the East India Company. Since you've studied China, we would like to know as to, what are your views about those arguments out there? Whether China has such agenda, whether China is just capable of, colonizing Pakistan, because you've read both Pakistan and China. So I would like you to settle some of these arguments for our audience as well. Thank you.
Sure. I don't know whether I'll settle the arguments, but I'll do my best. On the China-UK relationship as it might apply in the context of Pakistan and CPEC. So yes, the UK-China relationship is heading in a very different direction because Huawei's been made a kind of litmus test. The US has made it kind of a litmus test, but China as well has made it a litmus test. It does create some problems for China as well if countries then make the alternative choice. There would have been a much more low-key way of doing this, which is, I mean, China's rolling out its 5G networks. There'll be a small percentage of this will go to non-Chinese suppliers. The vast preponderance of it will go to Chinese suppliers. There are areas that China considers to be kind of national security essential, in which it doesn't allow certain outside firms involvement in its economy. And of course, we see what goes on in the internet in China, where there are a number of firms that are completely excluded, and you can't access a number of the main US internet firms and things like this. So there would have been a way of saying, well, this is an area that is defined if this is defined in a security context, maybe we just have to kind of live with this on the Huawei issue. But they've kind of defined this in a way that now means that if the UK, as looks as if it will be the case, makes a decision for reasons that partly do also relate to the relationship with the US, that says this is a security concern, we're going in a different direction. In other circumstances, this might have been left as a discrete issue. Because it's being made such a kind of, because it's been made to be such a sort of critical litmus test issue, it kind of further pushes a logic on the UK's part, which is you have to move further and harder on some other issues as well. Now, I mean, Hong Kong issue is extremely important in the UK-China context as well, and everything that's happening there. And there has been a wider mood sort of swing in the UK if you look at the polling data and things. And so you've seen significant political shifts in the Conservative Party, in the Labour Party, and the mood change in the government itself. It is moving in a very different direction. But it's not going to be the case that there are then that you go into a kind of full US China style confrontation. There are going to be areas in which the two sides will still find ways to work together, and I think it's still in China's interest and in the UK's interest that some of that is sort of salvaged from this, even if I think it is going to be a very difficult period for the relationship. And I do think that when it comes to the development agenda, international economic cooperation in certain places and things, that it's not inconceivable that this would still be something that was able to continue. The question of whether it is called CPEC or not is an issue that is going to be there for a lot of countries as well. It's quite easy actually in practice to find ways of cooperating on projects, or at least developing some projects that are relatively complementary. I mean, if it's green energy projects and things like that the UK is interested in seeing and China's interested, I mean, there are ways of doing this in complementary ways without saying that you're cooperating on CPEC or something like that. And of course, the UK also, going back to one of the earlier questions, India would not be particularly happy to see anything that resembles a sort of endorsement of CPEC, but some of these, and this is going to be a question in an Afghanistan context as well, where I think in lots of cases people are going to be keen to see additional Chinese economic commitments. Whatever the critical view on a lot of what's going on in the Belt and Road as a whole, they're still going to want to see, if you were to get to a political settlement there, some level of heightened Chinese economic involvement in the aftermath, because that's what the Afghan government wants, apart from anything else. And so you're going to have to come up with some ways of figuring out between a number of actors in Afghanistan's future as well, like what does that economic map, what does the connectivity map need to look like? Pakistan is going to be a part of that. CPEC is going to be a part of it. But are you going to call it cooperation on CPEC or CPEC linkages? Or are you going to say, look, here are some forms of economic cooperation, here are some forms of infrastructure linkages, here are some forms of energy cooperation and so on, that don't necessarily have some of these labels attached to it? I think that is going to be possible. And I think the UK is one of the actors, given its role there and things that less so in the overall weight of things than some others, but would also be present in that. And I don't think that form of cooperation is precluded. I don't think it's ultimately precluded with the US, even in the right circumstances as well, though it's just much harder than it would have looked even a couple of years ago. And then to this final question, so the BRI in a number of countries, it is problematic for some countries. There are debt problems. There is a situation in which some of the corruption attached to the project has taken place at a sort of stratospheric level. I mean, there are a lot of the critiques of the BRI are strongly felt and embraced, not from the US side, but from political forces in these countries that are unhappy with what they're seeing. I can go down the list of what this amounts to. I don't think it's just a kind of geostrategic game. I think there have been some, in the first few years, they tried to move ahead very quickly on a very large scale, not always making the best judgments about what these projects all needed to amount to. If you look at Xi Jinping's speech at the last Belt and Road Forum, it was one of the closest things I've ever seen from Xi Jinping to a kind of humble, semi-apologetic kind of version of this. BRI needs to be balanced. Some of these things need to be revisited. The criticism that you're getting in some of these countries and from the US side and from others is stuff that you hear in the Chinese system as well, and that you had in the Chinese system from the very start. You had language used from certain Chinese actors that I dealt with was much stronger than the external criticism they were getting, frankly. Words that would have seen as inflammatory, frankly, from talking about transnational great leap forward and things like that. So yes, there are critical things about the Belt and Road, and yes, we can look at CPEC and make an analysis of, okay, how far do these things apply in the case of CPEC? Now, the one thing I would say that is substantially different, two things that are substantially different. One, a lot of the things that China is accused of kind of wanting to gain from the BRI and things in a lot of countries, it gets from Pakistan anyway. China doesn't need to upgrade its economic involvement in order to gain kind of improved security relations or military ties. Those things existed already. It's in the case of CPEC, China was adding an economic dimension to a relationship that had been entirely predicated on security, military, intelligence ties already. So the version that is CPEC as a kind of driver for then, you know, China can get a base or develop dual use facility, they could do that anyway. So the important thing from my perspective on CPEC specifically was that it added a substantial and genuine economic dimension to a relationship that hadn't had it before. And the issues that have been in play have largely been kind of economic difficulties, political reactions to economic difficulties, as necessarily these kind of security strategic concerns that, you know, are there if you're looking at PLA Navy calling in Colombo, or and a lot of the other cases, even what played out in Djibouti, which, you know, did have a kind of debt dimension to it in the background as well. So I think that's very different in Pakistan's case. The other thing is that I think China was quite attuned in Pakistan's case, going back to the very beginning of this discussion that we've been having, to like, what sort of Pakistan is valuable to China? The version of Pakistan that is valuable to China is a strong, capable, stable country able to play a particular role in the region of a sort that China's always wanted to see it play. What does that translate into for CPEC? Yes, you're going to have, in the actual practical negotiations, countries running around, companies on the Chinese side running around, getting whatever deals they can, behaving in the way that they behave in China, behave in other countries as well. You're not always going to get that strategic intent translating in practical terms to everything that then plays out on the ground. But in terms of the kind of underlying objectives of China, what China thought it was doing with CPEC, they were, you know, going through this kind of phased, here are, you know, we helped fix the infrastructure issues and energy issues, you know, in line with the government's preferences and their agenda in Pakistan. We then move on to industrial cooperation and build on that. This helps Pakistan's kind of wider, longer term economic agenda and strengthens its power position in the region. It's helpful if Pakistan has an economy that's growing at a rate that means that it can also sustain military budgets at a certain level. You know, all of these things are there in the Pakistani case and with CPEC in a way that is quite different from a lot of other countries. Is it unhelpful for China if Pakistan has a serious debt problem? Yes. China doesn't gain some hugely beneficial additional leverage. The interests on a lot of critical areas are aligned. It doesn't need to have some kind of additional means of squeezing Pakistan or putting pressure on them in different ways. It has the relationships and the means to get a lot of what it wants already. So I have been quite skeptical, therefore, of the version of it that is the kind of colonization, East India Company, all of these sorts of things. Again, going back, like, there are real risks in other places, but the case of Pakistan is different. And the issues that have been there with CPEC, and there are issues with CPEC, but I think they've in lots of cases been intrinsic to some of the internal political and economic dynamics on the two sides. They haven't been characterized by an agenda on China's part that is, what we want with this is to, put Pakistan in trouble, or we accept the logic that if Pakistan gets in trouble, we can then extract some, dedicated military facility that we wouldn't otherwise have, or anything like this, or the kind of East India Company logic to what kind of deeper and heightened involvement might be. I don't think that's the form of relationship that China wanted with Pakistan. I mean, I think there is a lot of rethinking and rebalancing and tapering back and everything that we've seen with CPEC in the last couple of years. And again, there are some issues there, but they're not necessarily the same issues that are there in a lot of the other BRI cases. And certainly, if you're only looking at the kind of strategic intent and strategic goals that China has with this, you have to look at a very different context in terms of the pre-existing relationship. And frankly, the damage that would be done to that if China behaved in a certain way with CPEC, it's been very valuable. It's been built up over a very long time. It matters that China has public opinion in Pakistan in the place that it has been. It doesn't have that in many other cases. It doesn't have a military relationship of the sort that it has in certain cases. How important, how valuable is it to China to then damage all of that by taking some of these steps? I would say it has not been in their interest to do this. And I think that will continue to be true in the next few years. If anything, I think it will mean they're more cautious about the scale and nature of what they actually do with this, because I think there have been concerns in Pakistan of precisely the nature that you've laid out. And what it may well mean is that you get, as I think we're now seeing, a kind of somewhat tapered back version of CPEC that is a bit more cautious about some of these sorts of reputational risks, including inside the country and including in their relations with the army and including in their relations with business and with the public. And I think they need to come up with a version of it that will work better. And I think that will tend to mean something that's somewhat smaller than the scale of what was originally envisaged. And I think that's, whenever we get the next Xi Jinping visit and CPEC Mark II, and everything's all still pushing ahead and things, and yes, but also I think there've been a lot of lessons taken from the first phase as well.
Thank you so much. Brilliant articulation there, Andrew. And you're very right. There is a public perception of China's all-weather friendship in Pakistan, which is different from its official perception. And I'm sure that is valuable to China. So China-Pakistan relationship might have, as you've written in your book and various works, it might have been seen initially as a balancer, but over a period of years, there has been a qualitative change, as you and Daniel Markey also allude to, that this partnership has finally stepped out of its shadows. Every time I read something about Pakistan and China, it begins with that there is a poor understanding of this relationship. I hope that the kind of work that you are doing and the kind of work that Daniel Markey is doing to bring forth some of the opportunities, challenges that this relationship has, is going to help clear a lot of our misperceptions about this relationship, not only in Pakistan but also around the globe. So thank you so much for an extremely enriching, insightful session with us. I know it's been 2 hours. I would like to thank all of our attendees and for the questions that they've posted. So until next time, stay safe, stay at home. I see that you are at home. And with the kind of protest going in DC, just take care of yourself. And thank you so much for your time and availability today. It has been extremely enlightening meeting you virtually and listening to you and reading your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and to your colleagues, including Said, just disappeared again,
Yeah, connectivity issues dropped
and
out.
also thanks to all the participants. It was a really excellent set of questions. Thanks so much for the chance to discuss this with you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.